Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Bhakti Fundamentals. Today, we return with a question and answer session on the topic of what is the purpose of life? This essential question often lingers in the background of our consciousness, occasionally surfacing in moments of reflection. However, it's actually far more beneficial for us to actively seek the answer to this question as soon as we possibly can, because having the answer to it allows us to direct our lives in the most advantageous manner. From childhood in our society, we are presented with a blueprint or formula for success. Get an education, find a stable job, build a family, accumulate wealth, and leave behind a legacy. However, despite following this formula for material success, we see that people still feel unfulfilled. Even those who seem to have it all, celebrities, comedians, materially successful individuals, often struggle with depression and anxiety, drug addiction, alcohol dependence, etc. No matter how much we acquire materially, there is always uncertainty, suffering, and ultimately death for our material bodies, at which point we must leave behind everything material that we worked so hard to accumulate. If our true purpose and true happiness were found in material wealth, comfortability, career success, etc., then why do so many people who have these things still feel dissatisfied? In short, it's because they have not discovered the true purpose of life. So just what is the real purpose of life? The true purpose of life lies beyond matter, beyond this temporary material world. Everything we see around us, our bodies, possessions, and even this world itself, will eventually fade away. Matter is temporary, constantly changing, and ultimately perishable. What we truly seek is something permanent, something that will last. That something is spirit. The true purpose of life is spiritual in nature. While matter is temporary, spirit is eternal. The Bhagavad-gita, an ancient spiritual philosophical scripture spoken by the Supreme Absolute Truth himself, reveals that the purpose of life is threefold. 1, to become self-realized, to first understand who or what we are. We learn in the Gita that we are the Jivatma, or soul, individual, eternal, spiritual beings. 2, to realize the Supreme, to understand our source and the source of all that be, Krishna, the Supreme Absolute Truth, identified in the Gita to be Krishna, a name meaning all attractive. And 3, to reconnect to the Supreme via spiritual life, or Bhakti Yoga. We all actually have an eternal relationship with the Supreme, but this relationship remains dormant until we choose to revive it. Spiritual life is the means by which we awaken and act on this relationship, reconnecting us, the individual souls, to the Supreme, or Krishna. In the Gita, Krishna declares that Bhakti Yoga is the most direct and effective path to understand and reach him. Through the spiritual practices of Bhakti Yoga, we establish a direct connection to Krishna and gradually realize more and more about him as we advance along the path. Thus, this third aspect is deeply connected to the second, for it is through Bhakti Yoga that we come to truly realize the Supreme. Let's break down this threefold purpose of life now. The first aspect of the threefold purpose of life is self-realization, or understanding our true identity beyond these material bodies we find ourselves in. So imagine for a moment living your whole life in complete harmony with who you actually are, fully aware of your eternal spiritual nature, free from confusion about your real identity. How fulfilling would that be? Yet most people live without this fundamental knowledge, identifying themselves with temporary material bodily labels, such as their race, nationality, profession, or social status, rather than recognizing their true identity as the eternal spiritual soul within the body. We often hear statements like, I am American, I am a woman, I am Caucasian, or I am a healthcare worker. While the material designations in each of these statements may change over time, and certainly between lifetimes, we'll get to what that means in a moment, our essential identity, the I, remains constant. This unchanging self, often overlooked, is what we seek to understand in spiritual life. Now, what's wrong with not knowing who we really are? When we lack knowledge of the self, the soul, our true identity, then we remain uncertain about what we should pursue in life and where to place our focus. As a result, we often engage in temporary material pursuits, believing that material wealth, status, and achievements will bring happiness and purpose to our lives. Yet time and time again, we see that material pleasures are fleeting, and external validations fail to provide real fulfillment. Again, matter is by nature temporary. Thus, when we gain spiritual knowledge and recognize that we are not these temporary material bodies, but rather eternal spiritual beings, then our entire perspective shifts. We then begin to seek that which is permanent and fulfilling, the realization of our spiritual nature, and subsequently knowledge of the Supreme and of our eternal relationship with the Supreme. True self-realization therefore frees us from the cycle of material dissatisfaction and leads us toward real lasting happiness, a spiritual bliss that is independent of our material conditions in life. When Arjuna is overcome with anxiety and despair at the beginning of the Bhagavad-gita, faced with the painful prospect of battling his own family members, Krishna does not offer mere emotional consolation. Instead, he immediately speaks of self-realization, cutting through Arjuna's illusion and addressing the true nature of the self. In one of his foundational instructions, Krishna declares in Bhagavad-gita, chapter 2, verse 20, "For the soul there is neither birth nor death at any time. The soul has not come into being, does not come into being, and will not come into being. The soul is unborn, eternal, ever-existing, and primeval. The soul is not slain when the body is slain." From this verse, we understand that we, as souls, are eternal. Again, spirit is eternal. Matter is always in flux, always changing, and ultimately temporary. At the end of this life, our material bodies will fail to function. Our material bodies will die, but we, the soul, never cease to exist. And since we have always existed, it follows that we do not die when this body perishes. Rather, we, the soul, move on to another material body, unless we have perfected spiritual life, in which case we are liberated from the material world entirely. Krishna reinforces the changing of our material bodies at the time of death for the body in Bhagavad-gita chapter 2, verse 13, wherein he states, "As the embodied soul continuously passes in this body from boyhood to youth to old age, the soul similarly passes into another body at death. The self-realized soul is not bewildered by such a change." Our bodies in old age or middle age look very different from how our bodies looked in infancy, don't they? Well, this verse explains that just as we transition from childhood to youth to old age within this very lifetime, we also transition into another body at the time of death for our material bodies. But the soul itself never changes. It remains constant despite the external shifts in our material covering. Thus, death for our material body is just that, a change of external covering. It is not the end of our existence, but simply a transition from one body to another. Understanding this foundational spiritual truth, one of the beginning lessons of the Gita, frees us from many of the fears, anxieties, and attachments that arise due to our identification with our temporary material bodies. When we no longer see the body as our true self, we can shift our focus to what truly matters, furthering our spiritual pursuits. Now, once we understand that we are not temporary material bodies, but eternal spiritual beings, the next question naturally arises. Where do we come from? What is our ultimate source? Every living being and everything in existence has an origin. Just as a tree grows from a seed and a child has parents, our very existence points to a higher reality, a supreme source from which all living entities originate. Life comes from life. This brings us to the second aspect of our threefold purpose of life, realizing the Supreme. Throughout the Bhagavad-gita, Krishna reveals that he is the supreme absolute truth, the supreme person with whom we have an eternal, personal relationship. In chapter 7, verse 7, Krishna states, "O conqueror of wealth, Arjuna, there is no truth superior to me. Everything rests upon me as pearls are strung on a thread." This analogy of pearls on a thread is profound. Just as a thread holds a necklace together, unseen yet essential, Krishna is the unseen force sustaining and pervading all of existence. Though the thread is often unnoticed, when admiring the pearls, without it, the necklace would fall apart. Similarly, Krishna is the supreme reality upholding all of existence. Yet many fail to perceive or recognize his presence. As we'll find out, we require spiritual eyes, spiritual vision to perceive his presence. As we'll discover, perceiving Krishna's presence requires that spiritual vision, just as a blind person cannot see the sun even when it is shining brightly. One without spiritual vision cannot perceive the Supreme. Our material senses, limited and imperfect, cannot directly perceive the Supreme. However, just as a mirror covered in dust cannot reflect clearly, our consciousness, when clouded by material conditioning, prevents us from perceiving Krishna. When we clean the mirror, the reflection becomes clear. Similarly, through spiritual practices, our consciousness becomes purified, allowing us to recognize Krishna's presence. Krishna reveals knowledge of himself in the Bhagavad-gita to awaken our desire to know him more, to encourage us to act on our already existing eternal relationship with him. To this point, he declares in chapter 10, verse 8, "I am the source of all spiritual and material worlds. Everything emanates from me." In this very direct statement from the 10th chapter, Krishna states that he is the original source of all existence, both spiritual and material. He is not only the creator of the material universes, but also the source of all living beings, including us, the eternal souls. Everything emanates from him. But realizing the Supreme is not just about acknowledging Krishna as the source of existence, or merely believing in Krishna or God. It is about understanding our relationship with Him and acting accordingly. And the rest of the verse provides essential direction in this regard. Krishna continues, "The wise who perfectly know this engage in my devotional service and worship me with all their hearts." This latter part of the verse reveals an important truth. Real knowledge of the Supreme naturally leads to engaging in His devotional service, or Bhakti Yoga. And this is the third aspect of our threefold purpose of life: to engage in spiritual life in order to reconnect to our source, Krishna, in a relationship of loving devotional service. Realizing that we are eternal spiritual beings and that Krishna, the Supreme, is our eternal source is not the end of our spiritual journey. It's just the beginning. Once we understand who we truly are, individual souls, and where we come from, the Supreme, a natural question arises. How do we reconnect to our source, the Supreme? How do we revive our original eternal relationship with Krishna, which is currently lying dormant or inactive? Krishna provides us with the answer in the Gita. Bhakti Yoga, devotional service, is the process by which we awaken our dormant love for Him. This makes perfect sense. When we truly recognize Krishna as our eternal source, we want to be more than just passive observers who admire Him from a distance or just believe that He exists. Instead, a natural desire arises to know Him more deeply, to serve Him with devotion, and therefore re-establish our forgotten connection to Him. Our relationship with Krishna has always existed, but due to our long sojourn in material existence, we have forgotten it, just as a person in deep sleep forgets their waking identity. Bhakti Yoga is the process of reawakening, of rediscovering and nurturing our eternal bond with the Supreme. There are 9 processes of Bhakti Yoga, each providing a practical and powerful way to engage in devotional service. Bhakti Yoga is not passive, it is dynamic, transformative, and deeply personal. It is also a remedial process meant to heal the conditioned souls, all of us, from the layers of our material conditioning. It is, after all, our material conditioning that leads us to believe that we are matter instead of spirit. A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, the acharya or teacher who brought Bhakti Yoga to the West in the 1960s, often compared material life and consciousness to a disease or ailment, using the analogy of a fever. He wrote, "The material covering of the pure spirit soul is an external feature, as much as fever is an external feature of the unhealthy body. The general process is to decrease the degree of the fever and not to aggravate it by maltreatment." Our layers of material conditioning, our false identification with matter, are like a fever. Just as the proper treatment for a fever is to gradually reduce its intensity through proper care, the 9 processes of Bhakti Yoga are meant to purify us from our material conditioning, from the fever of material existence, and reinstate us in our original healthy state, in which we are fully spiritually conscious. As we embark on the path of Bhakti Yoga, we can begin by incorporating simple yet powerful practices that help us reconnect with the Supreme. Some of these include 1. Chanting the Maha Mantra, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. This mantra consists solely of the Supreme Lord's names, making it immensely purifying to chant. Indeed, by chanting it, we gradually shed our layers of material conditioning and awaken our innate spiritual consciousness. 2. Reading the Bhagavad-gita and other Bhakti scriptures. By studying Krishna's words and the teachings of the Bhakti tradition, we gain a deeper understanding of who Krishna is and all the details of our relationship with the Supreme. And 3, offering our daily activities to Krishna and offering our vegetarian food items to Krishna prior to consuming them. By performing our work, family responsibilities, and daily activities in a spirit of loving devotional service to Krishna, we begin to spiritualize those aspects of our lives, transforming even seemingly ordinary tasks into spiritual service. In a similar way, our food actually becomes spiritualized when we offer it to Krishna prior to consuming it ourselves. Note that we practice ahimsa or non-violence in Bhakti Yoga, since animals are actually jivas or souls in different bodies. So these are just 3 simple practices that we can start out with in Bhakti Yoga, but engaging in them immediately begins to awaken our connection to the Supreme. And as we continue, this connection deepens, gradually purifying our consciousness and leading us toward ultimate fulfillment, realizing our eternal relationship with the Supreme. So this week, consider this 3-fold purpose of life. 1, to become self-realized, to realize who we truly are as eternal spiritual beings beyond the material body and mind. 2, to realize the Supreme, or Krishna, to understand our source and the source of all that be, Krishna, the Supreme Absolute Truth. 3, to reconnect with the Supreme through Bhakti Yoga, to actively revive our forgotten relationship with Krishna through the 9-fold devotional practices of Bhakti Yoga. And take a moment to reflect. Where will your life be in 5 years if you start acting on your spiritual purpose today? Imagine the lasting happiness and inner fulfillment that will result as you uncover your eternal relationship with Krishna. Now, contrast that with the alternative. If you don't pursue spiritual life, what will change in your life and the lives of your loved ones? Likely, nothing. Material life will continue on as it has up to this point, bringing with it the usual material temporary ups and downs and no lasting satisfaction. So start your spiritual journey today. If you have any questions about how to begin, reach out to us. We're here to help. Remember that you can email us anytime at bhaktifundamentals@gmail.com. For now, this concludes our discussion on the purpose of life, though there is so much more to explore on the topic, so stay tuned for more classes as we dive deeper into this essential topic. In the meantime, thank you for listening today, and we'll see you next time on Bhakti Fundamentals.